I felt that we had to be considering doing something specific to enable women or empowering women to become more vocal, to get education, so that they can actually become prime movers in the community.
She was a talented lady, very strong, and she didn't spare herself. I remember leaving my home with minutes that I'd written at 11:30 at night to go and put them through her door so that she would have them, because sometimes out of the meetings action was needed and you wanted to do it right away before you lost time. And I don't know what my husband thought of it, you know, but there it is. I think we did work together and achieve as a team. Those meetings led to island organizations, for example, the Jamaica Association, the Trinidad and Tobago Society, and so on. And after some years, these organizations were part of the West Indian Organizations Coordinating Committee, that's WIOCC. And it was being part of WIOCC. We had a speaker from the Jamaica Commission, I think, and he said, it's time for you people to become involved in the economic life of the community. And 3 of our members went to London to an organization that was recommended. And they came back with the idea of an economic development site. What came to be known as Karaoke Enterprises. This was really launching a bit further into community to provide economic activity, because these units at Karaoke Enterprise were for business people, and because of the size of the units and the way the sizes ranged, it meant that an individual businessman could afford to rent the accommodation. It was a very important contribution to the economic life of the community, because if you have an enterprise like that, it means you can have different sized units, and it could provide for a starter, or it could provide for an already established business looking for good quarters.
Mrs. D was a very classy lady. I don't know about demure. I suppose, yeah, she was very respectable in the way she dressed and the way she came over and the way she dealt with people. And I think she commanded respect because of that, actually. What I also noticed with Mrs. D, that she would see what was going on in the community, and she wouldn't just see it, she would act on it. And I learnt a lot from her about that. You know, the things around school exclusions, I didn't know anything about those issues really till I met Mrs. D, and she would respond to that. So she would set up projects to address that. And there was a point when people were evacuated from Montserrat, and it was really Mrs. D who was the forerunner on that. And we were busy with other projects, and Mrs. D came in and said, right, there's all these people coming from Montserrat, we've got to respond. And I remember thinking, oh no, this is more work. But she was right, because nobody else actually was helping those women. And she responded to that by getting funds. She got the governor of Montserrat to come to the organisation. She got Welfare Rights to come in. Another woman, Jackie Bailey, who I used to work with as another activist, very prominent woman here, she responded. She helped set up the Montserrat Community Development Trust. But that was all down to Mrs. D, really. And I learnt that responsiveness from her, because for me it was like, well, we're doing this, this is our agenda, we're doing this, this and this. But she said, no, we're going to take this on as well. And there was one point, we had the office was full of duvets, and we had a fund, and we had things to give out. And I was groaning, actually. But she was right. And it was a kind of her kind-heartedness when I look back. You know, I was thinking, no, we've got a strategic plan. This isn't in our strategic plan. But she saw the need and she responded to it. And because of her, those people got houses, their children got back into school after being excluded, they set up a trust. So yeah, she was very, very personable.
So what came out of that was what was known as CCAME, which was the Coordinating Committee Assisting Montserrat Evacuees. So that was a collaboration between, it was joint working between the Women's Action Forum, because obviously, as I said, a lot of the women were going in there with whatever issues that they had. They would then, you know, direct women to the service that I was providing through the City Council as the African Caribbean link worker, and then obviously around housing, that's where Moscare became involved. Because at the time we were the key players in it, we thought actually we should just have a committee, it makes sense. I think Mrs D was instrumental to that. She was the one who said it. And I remember thinking when I first went to that meeting, because here's me mid-20s, and thinking, oh, I'm going to this meeting, but it was great. Mrs D was very embracing, and I felt extremely embraced by her for what I could bring. So she would ask me things, she would, you know, she'd say, right, Jackie, so this is what most of the women are coming with, what do you think we can do? She was very engaged in that process, and that was my first contact with Mrs D, and it was a very warming contact. I think people might have seen Mrs D on the outside and thought, oh, what a formidable woman. Just even the way that she looked and she came across and she spoke, but her heart was in the right place and she had the right principles and wanted to drive things forward for Black people and you know, and in particular African people.
Louise was a remarkable and inspirational member of the congregation here, and not only here within the church, but also nationally within the Church of England. She was certainly one of the first, if not the very first, Black church warden, female church warden in the country, and that was here at St Chrysostom's back in the 1970s. As well as that, she served as a member of General Synod, which is the governing council for the church nationally. So she represented Manchester there, again as a member of this church. And more locally, she served on the PCC of this church. That's the decision-making body that helps run this church for this community. So a huge number of roles of responsibility in that sense in the church nationally and locally here. But also on a weekly basis, she was so much a part of the life here. As church warden and as an everyday member, she welcomed everybody who came through the doors. She was part and parcel of every aspect of life here. And I know, you know, right down to the sorts of nuts and bolts of things. At the end of every week when we'd had our tea and coffee together and people had gone off home, it would be Louise that would first grab the brush and start sweeping up all the crumbs from the floor. You know, she was an incredible woman of immense service at every level, from the very highest levels right down to that sweeping up and taking care of the building and of the people here. And that's an incredible example to us all, isn't it?
I went through a period where I wasn't actually working. And I can't remember if it was the job centre or I can't remember how I ended up at Mushwaf. But I remember, you know, the building on the corner of Princess Road, and I think it's, I can't remember if it's Moss Lane East. I just remember it being on the corner. And the first time I went there as a volunteer, and I met Mrs. Da-Cocodia, and I was so impressed because she just had such presence. She was a very humble woman, but you know, she was just so nice to everybody. And while I was there, she was very encouraging because I was going through a low period where I was thinking, oh, I've done this and I've done that, and you know, where do I go from here? Because it's like, you know, everywhere I go, it's like doors are closed and I'm trying to do this and it's just so hard. And I was going through a period where I was feeling a bit sorry for myself. And the encouragement that she gave me, pointing out what I'd done already, what I'd achieved, you know, and telling me, yes, you can. You know, like Barack Obama says, yes, we can. And I think it was watching her and seeing all the things she was doing, and I thought, yeah, I can. And that gave me the courage to then continue with, I decided to do the counselling course as a result of that. And I saw all the women coming in, and I think there was a nursery, so the women would come in with their children, and you know, there were different groups where they would get encouragement and be helped to go on courses. And I was really impressed by what Mushwaf was doing. You know, Mrs. Da-Cocodia was at the head of that, you know, directing everybody and really making a huge difference, in the community with these women who, like me at the time, were probably a bit disillusioned. So, you know, that was how I got into that. And I then went back years later when I got to my level 4 to qualify as a counsellor. I went back and did my placement at Mushwaf. And again, it was just so nice to give something back.
When I was a secretary for the task force steering group, I could do shorthand. My mum sent me to shorthand college like good little girls. So I learnt to do shorthand and type very fast. I went to secretarial school. So I was the secretary, but the conversations that would be happening around that table, that especially when they got heated. So I was party to that from a very young age. I was party to strong women challenging the men around the table from a very young age. And Mrs. Da-Cocodia was one of them. So people like Mrs. Da-Cocodia were the ones that would go and say, we want this, not that we need it, we want this. We want this and we're supposed to have it. And so I was party to a lot of that kind of conversation. All the things that I would see and hear made me know that it's doable. And being a woman, a black woman, in a room of, 12 to 15 men, and she still came out on top, that's stayed with me. I'm often the only black woman in places where I work. So when you get to grow around women like that, it changes you, and it definitely pushes you to be able to do that yourself.
I met her in many different environments. Mushwaf was one, quite a lot of things around Culture Week at Cartmore Road, in a lot of meetings in the communities. She was stood up and talked, or was on platforms of talking on behalf of the community. Links with PACT, Positive Action, karaoke training. That was an opportunity that I really was grateful for, because I think it helped plant another seed for me to do what I'm doing now. And that was training employability skills for young people in the community. So it was part of the karaoke enterprise that Louise Da-Cocodia had been the founder member of, or is the founder member of. She still is, even though she's, God bless her soul, she's no longer with us. And so being part of that program was a big achievement for me, because I was able to design and deliver a package of training that helped people move on into their employments and their future careers. So it's been a catalyst, I believe, for me, and a foundation for what I'm doing today.
Louise was a family member. My daughter and her daughter grew up together, and when I worked at Full Employ, I used to do a lot of travelling throughout England. So my daughter would stay with Louise, and she'd do her hair, and just like I would. You know, she was a typical Jamaican woman in her home. She was very posh the way she spoke, and a lot of people didn't sometimes like her. They thought she was a bit standoffish because she spoke the way she did, but she wasn't. She was a very warm, loving person and very caring, but she was the sort of person that always encouraged me and supported me, no matter what. I remember my mum, one Christmas, just after Christmas, we got a call that she was ill, and we were going to a meeting, and I'd just told her about it, and we were going to a meeting. She was driving me, and she said, if you need anything, if you need some money, I'm here, that's all. And I didn't ask her anything. During the time she was poorly, my mum used to go up and help her out, stay with her. And in the last few years when she wasn't well, and being Louise, I used to bring her down to my home. My daughter used to say, what are you doing this weekend, Auntie Louise? And she'd always try and make an excuse because she wasn't going anywhere, because she couldn't. And she'd say, well, I'm coming for you, you're coming down for dinner. So we'd bring her down, and then she'd have dinner with us and take her home and get her ready for bed and things like that. So she was very, very, very close to me, and she always, one of my staff here who knew Louise, she worked at Mushwaf as an admin, she used to say to me, "You're getting just like Mrs. Da-Cocodia," you know, with all the meetings and stuff that I used to go to. And she says, you know, "Don't wash yourself out." So she was that sort of inspiration. And she was a special lady. And if I'd done something wrong and I'd see her, I'd say, "Right, okay, go on, just give it to me." Because I know she's going to tell me off. I'd say, "Go on, just do it." You know, so I loved her dearly, and my family did, and yeah, she was special.
Mrs. Da-Cocodia was a governor at lots of schools, I think, primary schools and secondary schools in the local area, central Manchester. She was a governor at St Chrysostom's School, as well as the church here, and also at Trinity High School. For a number of years, which I used to always look up to her. And when I went to college, actually, in Manchester, Sheena Simon College, which opened in 1982, she became a governor there and encouraged me, actually, to become a student governor. So that was my first step onto that kind of ladder of influence, if you like, to influence the students if I could. And that was all through her. Her being around and knowing what she was doing influenced me to do that. So I went to St Chrysostom's as a child. My children went to St Chrysostom's. So I have lots of links with the church. My eldest son was did his communion here. Excuse me. And I've been involved as a governor at St Chrysostom's when my first son was actually there. So, yeah, I've sort of followed in Mrs. D's footsteps a little bit of the way, I think.
We had the Mossad and Hume Task Force, which Louise worked at. And because I was looking at young people who lived in the task force area, I thought, let me approach her to find out whether or not the task force would be willing to sponsor my fees for the second year, or because in order for me to complete the course. So I spoke to her, and then she took it to the committee and came back, and it was positive. So that was my first kind of direct contact with Louise, even though I'd been working with her indirectly. Louise was ahead of her time, because there's a woman called Diane, a postgraduate student from Jamaica, who PhD got funded by Karaoke Education Trust. And her job was to do a research around the experiences of black pupils, in particular boys, within schools. And one of her findings is that you will find that black students are concentrated in particular courses. So, for example, we're underrepresented in IT, medicine, finance, in that area. And one of the reasons why we're underrepresented is that most of the people are returning to education. So they've returned to education. So unlike others, white students that go through their GCSEs, A-levels, and straight to university, in a lot of cases, that's not been the case for a lot of black students. So therefore, they're limited in terms of the type of courses that they can apply for. And I think it's this reason why Louise set up Karaoke Education Trust to support black students who were enrolled on non-traditional areas of studies like medicine, finance, IT, engineering, because it's about increasing our representation at that level.
We had a weekend event which we called Celebrating African Caribbean Mothers in the Community. And I can't remember exactly how it came about, but there were several women involved in it, and it was part of a general program of events that were happening around Women's Day, around just celebrating the achievements of women. And Mrs. Da-Cocodia was one of the people behind encouraging that kind of event. And so we had a weekend event, and this was an interesting thing in that it had to be at the weekend because people were working or studying. It had to have a creche because they had to be able to bring their children. And we had it at the Green Haze Centre, which is right in the heart of Moss Side and has always been a very inclusive type of centre. Belonged to the City Council, was part of their adult education programme, but it was a place where people felt very welcome to come in And so we had seminars, women talked about their experience, people exchanged ideas, we had lunch, we had the children playing, and it was just a consolidating experience for us all. And it's the type of event that Mrs. Da-Cocodia caused to happen in many different ways. And it was one of many things of that type. I remember we had a study school one weekend, and that involved the young people as well as their parents. And at the Women's Action Forum, we had several training sessions for women that were partly about identifying their skills and partly about helping them to plan what they wanted to do next. And she was very much the driving force behind those kinds of things, along with other women, of course, and many younger women who were working in the community like I was. And it kind of gave us the cement to get together and actually make something happen. And so I don't really think of myself as an activist, but I very much liked to make something happen. And she was a very encouraging force for that type of thing.
The first time I ever met Louise, she interviewed me for a job that I'd applied for. So it was the census enumerator. So she interviewed me for that particular job. But as part of, even though after the interview, Louise was still my mentor, because I had to report back to her, with me doing, you know, collecting the census and all that, I had to report back to her. So during that time, Louise put a question to me and she said, well, I'm involved with a task force, but we want to start this women's organisation. We have had talks about it. So she said, would you be interested? So I thought, why is she asking me this question? But Louise being Louise, she saw something within me that she thought she needs to bring out. When I look at all the things that the forum did, we touched on a lot of things: education, women into work, women into construction. We dealt a lot with the Montserratan community because a lot of them came through our doors, and we helped assist them in getting certain things that they needed. At that time, funds were flowing, but obviously you've got to access certain funds, and then it becomes difficult if you don't have a fundraiser within the organisation. So the last stages of the forum basically is that we'd open the Children's Paradise Nursery with the idea of incorporating other elements into having the nursery. But due to funding, I mean, it's the little organisations that do a lot of work, but they don't seem to be funded enough. So unfortunately, the organisation had to fold. One of the downsides of the Women's Forum is I don't think when it was set up they were expecting it to run for so long.
If I'm honest with you, I'm going to say she was somebody who I more admired as a person, and I've had some links with her. I wasn't as fortunate as other people to have worked with her very closely. I knew her very well socially. She came to every party I had at home. But I've made a little note actually here about the number of things I've done with her personally. One of them is in this book, and I'm going to have to fish for it if you don't mind. This one is called Issues and Services for People with Learning Disabilities from Black and Ethnic Minority Communities. I thought Louise would be a good person to help me with this book. I was then a researcher at Bristol University, a research fellow at Bristol University, and my team was tasked with producing this book, researching it, and I knew Louise would have a perspective on it from her personal experience, but also from her professional experience. And I would tell any young person now that Caribbean women built the NHS. And I say that for a reason. You probably know that Enoch Powell, at the time as health minister, actively recruited women from the Caribbean to help to develop the NHS as nurses and as other people in the health sector. So they were actively invited to do that. But then when you look at standards, you know, I'm going to, if you don't mind, I'm going to slip over to talk about individuals that you might have heard of, people like Louise Da-Cocodia. They're the women who helped to raise standards. So people like Cherry Byfield, people like Louise Da-Cocodia who worked in the service. And they usually worked in areas which were seen as marginalized. So if you're black, you're more likely to be a geriatric nurse looking after old people, or a psychiatric nurse looking after mentally ill people, or a nurse looking after people with learning disabilities, because those are the areas mainstream. These are people on the margins who nobody wanted to work with. So BME people, black and minority people, were pushed in those directions. And it was us, single-handedly, and I say that, who raised the standard of the service, who showed compassion, and who began to, I know Louise in particular showed the kind of skills and high professionalism which raised the standard of services for people on the fringes of society in this country.
The plight of our patients then was absolutely horrendous because there really was no service whatsoever. And so as I continued working as a health visitor, I started to get phone calls from people who were either not able to access service or just wanted information about the condition. And then we started a series of talks as well with the then Public Health Director, Dr. Povey. And as a result, I'm cutting a lot out, really. There was a lot that went on, many meetings and campaigns and so forth. But the end result was that he was able to secure funding for a 2-year action research project to just look at what the issue was in Manchester around sickle cell and how best to ameliorate the problem. We were very fortunate because we had a steering group and their main function really was around fundraising as well as raising awareness of sickle cell. And we had some superb kind of individuals. A lot of them actually were from Granada. People like Lisa from Coronation Street, Charles Lauder. We had also Mrs. Louise Da-Cocodia. We had Clive Lloyd, Waveney Lloyd. We had a number of individuals on that group. And that helped to promulgate the information as well as raising funds, because at that time it was a research project, we weren't mainstream funded. So yeah, we achieved a lot. And you know, I remember even Mrs. Da-Cocodia, she would bring her daughter to the meetings and she'd just sit very quietly outside while we continued with the meetings. It was the dedication of that group was amazing. I think we all had the same vision and we all worked collectively together to improve the quality of care for patients or people within our community who suffered from sickle cell.
I think her many, many, many years of service in this place were a huge beacon of light. And so it's really fitting that actually the lighting that we have in the chancel here at church at the front, that's been put in memory of Louise. And I think sort of that symbol of light, Louise as a beacon of light to us all, as a beacon of light in the community, and a beacon of how things can be different and how we can all be part of that change. And to have that lighting in the church now is a wonderful sign of that.
I'm quite in awe of Mrs. D and always will be. She was a great influence on my life and continues to be a great influence, and I just hope I can do her proud and make her proud as well.
I think the world is, I wouldn't say a different place to when I was a younger woman, but there are a number of different factors at play, and the way that the challenges, for example, that young people face, I think those challenges can sometimes lead them into dangerous situations. And they do need to have the wisdom and the encouragement of the older generation, which helps to keep them going.
I know that the Louise Da-Cocodia Education Trust still has their Saturday school, and that's a wonderful, vibrant thing. And I remember when I used to work with them, one of the things I did was I made one of our assessment tests based on a little passage giving an account of who Mrs. Da-Cocodia was. Because it was called Mrs. D's Saturday School, but many of the young people didn't know who Mrs. D was. And I think, you know, that's like a little cameo of what we need to do. We need to have a proper account. So when people say, oh, so who was this Mrs. Da-Cocodia? We can say, here, look at this. See who she was.
A lot of young people from the black and ethnic minority communities in particular, that's what I know about a lot of being from that community, don't know our history. They don't know what we've been through, no idea. And I think active ways of getting this information over to them that, you know, right here in Manchester, there have been people who've worked hard so that you can have a better life.
She's had a touch of everything, you know. She was selfless, she worked selflessly, because I remembered the days when she was doing her community stuff and the children were young and we were at meetings at Carmel Road. The kids were sleeping on people's laps. That's how much she gave to this community. And she worked in Ashton at the time, so what she was doing wasn't part of her work, not like a lot of people who work within the area. It had nothing to do with her job because she was a nurse, a nursing officer in Tameside. So she used to come after work and do all the things she did in the area. So that's why, for me, she was one of the most special people in Manchester, that through her work, a lot of our organisations are where we are now, and the respect that we get from maybe the council is through somebody like Louise.